you see, we must be aware that at the largest level, we as human beings are living in one of the most exciting moments of world history.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing profound changes, right, in the international order. And I just mentioned 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Firstly, we are seeing the end of the era of Western domination of world history, right? You know, from the year 1 to the year 1820, the 2 largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. Always.
Mm.
But in 1950, United States alone had 50% of the world's GNP, and China and India combined had only around 5%.
Mm.
So China and India shrunk dramatically over the last 200 years.
Mm.
But that was an artificial period. That was an aberration. That aberration is ending. We're now returning to the norm of 2,000 years, where China and India will once again be the largest economies in the world.
Mm.
All this has happened the last 30 years,
Mm.
right? Amazing. So that is one profound shift. And by the way, the West has difficulty accepting it, adjusting to it, which is why I always write essays pointing out how the West should adjust. For example, today is Wednesday.
Mm.
On Monday, 2 days ago, the Financial Times published a column by me, amazingly. Financial Times is a British publication. Published a column by me saying that it's time for the United Kingdom to give up its permanent seat in the UN Security Council, give up its veto in this UN Security Council, and give it to India. Because India is now much more powerful as a country than the United Kingdom. Now, that's an amazing statement to make, because remember, 100 years ago, in the year 1924, 100,000 Englishmen could effortlessly rule over 300 million Indians. Can you imagine today the British sending 100,000 people to India and saying, hey, let me run your country for you? It's impossible, right? But that happened 100 years ago. So that was an aberration. So now history has come full circle. And 100 years ago, the British were so much more powerful than India. Now, India is more powerful than the United Kingdom. So it's time for the British to give up their Security Council seat. I can assure you that they won't do so. I guarantee you they won't do so, because countries never give up privileges that they have acquired in the global system. But the fact that there's been this profound shift in human affairs is something that we should be aware of, number one. And secondly, we are also, over the next 10 to 20 years, in a sense, going to be watching the biggest wrestling match ever in human history. And that's a geopolitical contest between the United States and China. It will gain momentum and accelerate over the next 10 to 20 years for reasons that I gave in my book as China Won. The structural reasons why this contest is happening. So we are living in amazing times. And I feel like every morning I'm sitting at the edge of my seat, trying to figure out, wow, the world is changing so dramatically. This is absolutely amazing.
And for you, it is exciting.
Incredibly exciting, because I'm seeing changes that are unprecedented. And so I am actually living through the most exciting phase of my entire life. One endangered species called the lover of the United Nations. I love the United Nations passionately, because I think today, if you try to create the United Nations and try to negotiate among the 193 countries, you would never get as beautiful a document as the United Nations Charter that, as you correctly said, was drafted after World War II in 1945, basically by the Western powers. But so all the world knows is that the West created the UN, whether China is also a permanent member. And we also know that the UN is very weak. That's a fact. But why is the UN weak? And here the paradox is that even though it was the West, especially the United States of America, that created the UN, it is the West, led by the United States, that is weakening the UN. Right? And I can tell you one story. When I was ambassador to UN from 1984 to 89, the foreign minister of Singapore was Mr. S. Dhanabalan. And when he came to the UN for the General Assembly in September, he would meet his American counterpart, Mr. George Shultz, who's a wonderful human being, by the way, the Secretary of State. So George Shultz complained about how weak and inefficient the United Nations was. So Mr. Dhanabalan said very bravely to Mr. George Shultz, Mr. Shultz, I agree with you that the UN is weak and inefficient. Don't you think it's now time for us to find a Secretary General that is dynamic, effective, and a go-getter? Right? And George Shultz literally blushed. Because it is American policy, with the support of the then Soviet Union, to only select Secretary Generals who were spineless. Because the United States and Soviet Union didn't want to have a strong, dynamic, effective Secretary General like the former Swedish Secretary Generals Dag Hammarskjöld. So they picked spineless Secretary Generals. So if you pick a spineless Secretary General, how can you expect to have an effective organization? Any organization with a spineless leader is going to be a weak organization. So the paradox is that it's the West that is weakening the United Nations. But one of the big themes of my writings, especially in my book, The Great Convergence, is that the West is acting against its own interests when it undermines the United Nations. Because, to put it very simply, the world has shrunk. We live in a global village. And in any global village, you need a village council. Only functioning village council we have is the United Nations. And if you live in a global village, it's the minority that should be frightened of disorder. And the West represents a minority in the global village. Because the West represents 12% of the world's population. It is the West that should be strengthening the global village council rather than undermining it. And so the other thing that is very strange about our world is that we've got used to a world in which the Western countries used to produce the strong, dynamic, effective leaders, whether it's Churchill or de Gaulle, or as I described in my memoirs when I accompanied Mr. Lee Kuan Yew on his farewell tour of Europe in 1990. We met incredible European leaders like Margaret Thatcher, François Mitterrand in France, and Helmut Kohl in Germany. But today, I mean, the UK has produced prime ministers like Boris Johnson, who's a joker, literally a joker, who destroyed his country by engineering Brexit. And then his successor was a joke, Liz Truss. She lasted in office shorter than a head of lettuce, right? Yeah. So it is shocking that a country that could produce great leaders like Churchill, like Margaret Thatcher, and now prime ministers who are jokers. And so the West, therefore, is losing its way in a world that it can no longer control. And this is where it's time for Asian countries to step up and provide greater leadership. But when the Asians try to do that, the West resists it. So that's why I argued in my article in the Financial Times 2 days ago that the UK, which now produces jokers as leaders, should give it up its seat to India, which is a much more serious and much more dynamic country than the UK is. But they want to keep their privileges of their past and not accept the changes. Well, I think, I turned 75 last year. So I decided that it's time to maybe tell the story of my life. And also because I find that many young Singaporeans are not aware that Singapore has had a very special and unique history. That that Singapore has actually, I make the claim several times, so far unchallenged, that since human history began, Singapore is the most successful country. And what do I mean by that? I mean by that the Singapore has managed to lift the living standards of its people faster and more comprehensively than any other country has done in human history. Now that's a remarkable statement to make, remarkable statement to make. And I wrote that first when Singapore turned 50 in 2015. And in an article published in California by California News Syndicate, 400,000 downloads. No one challenged me. So I think it's important for Singaporeans to understand that, and this is what I actually tried to do with my latest book, Living the Asian Century. I tried to describe how the founding fathers of Singapore were political and economic geniuses. And I had the great pleasure, looking back now, and privilege of spending time with the three key founding fathers of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam. And I thought, it's so sad that we had three great men who at the end of the day successfully created a great nation, and young Singaporeans are not aware of it, and that's a tragedy. So I hope that I bring out the human qualities of these three great men and perhaps spark a little interest among young Singaporeans in knowing more about their founding fathers. Well, actually, that's a very difficult question to answer. And I mean that quite seriously, because what is also unique about Singapore is that we've had the same political party in power since 1959. 49 plus 24 is 65 years. And this political party is in power not because of brutal military rule, which is how normally most governments stay in power, but because it wins elections every 5 years. And the paradox is that because the PAP has been around for so long, it's so much a part of our fabric of our society that we don't notice it. And certainly because there's been political continuity in Singapore, there's been no discussion about the different phases of Singapore's history and what they were like. That's the paradox, because they say, well, but I know the PAP. It's the same political party that was there.
Yeah.
But actually, the founding generation were remarkable people. And the fact that they were so remarkable is so little known. Well, the negative consequence is that Singaporeans take their peace and prosperity for granted. But they forget that, if you assume that life gravitates to the mean, right? And the mean is that most political parties don't stay in office so long. And that you could have a situation, you could have freak elections, you could have the party change power and so on and so forth. And then you would have possibly, political turbulence in Singapore. But we haven't experienced any real political turbulence, I think, probably since the 1964 racial riots, which I describe in my book, Living the Asian Century. So I think it's important for us to be aware that because Singapore is exceptionally successful, this is not normal. And that for Singapore to keep going as an exceptionally successful state would require a lot of effort. But again, you don't get that sense of hunger among the young Singaporeans, to try and see what we can do to keep on going. Well, I mean, I think the biggest challenge for Singapore is that we take our exceptional success for granted. Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about my poverty, I don't know what you saw in the interview I did with Sumiko Tan in Straits Times. I said how the reason why I could never break down, even when I went through a lot of adversity and challenges in my life, was because my mother went through hell. When my father lost his job, when debt collectors came to our house, Chinese gangsters knocked on the door. My father rolled under the bed and asked me to tell the Chinese gangsters to go away because he knew he'd be beaten up very badly if they found him. So we lived through all that kind of hell, and we had people coming and putting signs at the door saying nothing in this house can be sold because it's all going to be auctioned to pay off the debts of Mr. Mohandas Mahbubani. So, and my mother went through that kind of hell and never broke down. In fact, my mother used to say, even when you're struggling and even if you're hungry, you must put butter on your lips and smile. So, in a sense, that's the competitive advantage I had. I could put butter on my lips and smile because my mother went through it. So I'm not going to break down under any circumstances. Now, in the case of Singaporeans, I would say the best thing they could do to understand how special it is to travel more. And, I describe in my book how at the age of 18, a friend of mine, very generously, an American friend of mine, Dean Swift, somehow or other gave me $2,000, which is a lot of money. So I hitchhiked up Malaysia, took the train from Penang to Bangkok, and then ended up flying from Bangkok to Calcutta, meet some relatives there. Then I took buses and lorries up to Nepal. Went up to walk alone up a mountain, Nagakot in Nepal, which is actually a stupid thing to do by yourself because at that time there were all kinds of problems. I could have easily disappeared traveling alone, but I survived it. But of course, when you survive it, then you say, "Wow, maybe I can do it." So I would say a little bit more adventure on the part of young Singaporeans, and especially. They should get to know Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia, I believe, is one of the most promising regions on planet Earth. Singaporeans worry that it'd be very difficult to grow the Singapore economy. That's absolutely correct. Very difficult. Your population is shrinking. Your standards of living are already very high. But the region is going to grow phenomenally over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And we are actually very fortunate that we have relatively well-functioning countries in Southeast Asia, certainly Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam is going to become a superstar economy. So why not go and experience these economies and work and live there for a while? Well, I mean, I would say, because of my diplomatic career, partly because of that, I probably visited countries in every corner of the earth. And when you work in the United Nations for 10 years, as I did, I lived in a global village. Every day I would walk down the corridors of the UN and I meet the ambassador from Botswana, the ambassador from Paraguay, the ambassador from Fiji. And, you get the sense, you understand the world. And you also get a sense of which countries are doing well and which countries are struggling. And in many parts of the world, let's say in Africa or even in South Asia, leaving aside India, which is doing very well, many countries in South Asia are struggling. Look at Bangladesh, for example, now, what just happened there. So amazingly, we live in a region where the countries are doing well. Indonesia is the most successful democracy in the Islamic world. And I was just in Jakarta 2 weeks ago because the incoming president of Indonesia, General Prabowo, set up a kind of a series of lectures for his incoming team. So I've been flying down there to speak to different members of his incoming team about how to prepare for the world that's coming. And so, and I also did, by the way, I also was invited by President SBY to talk to his cabinet. I've also met President Jokowi personally. So I've had the great privilege of getting to know 3 Indonesian presidents. And so when I speak about the country, I can do so with some confidence because I've dealt with the leaders.